For most of his life, Robert Mitchell followed the same routine every single day. For 35 years, he worked as a train conductor in a small Midwestern town. Every morning before sunrise, he would put on his uniform, drink a cup of black coffee, and walk to the station. The trains came and went, carrying people to distant places, but Robert stayed right where he was. He was a quiet man, responsible, reliable, but also ordinary. At least that's what he always believed. When Robert finally retired at the age of 65, his coworkers threw him a small farewell party. They gave him a watch and a handshake and thanked him for his years of service. The next morning, Robert woke up at the same time he always had, but this time there was no train to catch. The house felt strangely quiet. At first, retirement sounded like a dream, sleeping late, relaxing, enjoying life. But after a few weeks, Robert began to feel something he hadn't expected. Loneliness. The days felt long, too long. He would sit on his porch watching the clouds drift slowly across the sky. Sometimes he would walk through town just to hear the sound of people talking. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic of his old house, Robert found a dusty wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were a few old sketchbooks. He sat down on the floor and carefully opened one. The pages were filled with drawings, mountains, rivers, old barns. Faces of strangers on the train. Robert stared at them quietly. He had drawn these when he was young, before life became busy with work, bills, and responsibilities. He remembered something his high school teacher once told him. Robert, you have the eyes of an artist. But back then, art didn't seem practical, so he put his pencils away and never looked back, until now. That evening, Robert drove to a small art supply store in town. The young clerk looked surprised when he saw the elderly man studying the shelves carefully. "Can I help you find something?" the clerk asked. Robert smiled slightly. "Yes," he said. "I think I need some paint." He bought a few brushes, a small set of paints, and a canvas. Nothing fancy. That night, Robert set up a small table by the window of his living room. Outside, the sunset painted the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. For a moment, Robert simply watched. Then he picked up a brush. At first, his hands felt stiff. The lines weren't perfect. The colors didn't blend the way he wanted. But something inside him felt alive again. The next morning, he painted again. And the morning after that, days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Robert began painting the world he saw every day, the quiet streets of his town, the old train station, the maple trees that turned red in autumn. Sometimes he painted the sky. Sometimes he painted memories. One afternoon, a neighbor named Mrs. Collins stopped by his house. She noticed the paintings leaning against the walls. "Oh, my goodness, Robert," she said softly. "Did you paint these?" Robert nodded, a little embarrassed. "I'm just practicing," he said. Mrs. Collins shook her head gently. "These are beautiful." Soon, word began to spread around town. The librarian asked if Robert would like to display a few paintings at the local library. A small cafe owner offered to hang one on his wall. For the first time in his life, Robert saw people stop and look at something he had created. But the most important change wasn't the recognition. It was how Robert felt inside. The loneliness slowly faded. His days now had color. Every evening, as the sun began to set, Robert would sit near the window with his brushes and paint quietly. Sometimes he painted quickly. Sometimes he simply watched the light change. One evening, his grandson visited. The boy looked around the room, amazed by the paintings. "Grandpa," he asked, "when did you become an artist?" Robert thought for a moment. Then he smiled gently. "I didn't become an artist," he said. "I just finally had the time to remember that I always was one." The sun dipped below the horizon, filling the room with warm golden light. Robert picked up his brush once more. Because sometimes the most beautiful chapters of life don't begin when we are young. Sometimes they begin after retirement. And sometimes all it takes is a quiet evening, a brush, and the courage to begin again.